In the year 1162, somewhere on the windswept grasslands of northeastern Mongolia, a child was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, an omen. The shamans said that he would become a great warrior. His name was Temujin, and the world he entered was one of unimaginable brutality, where survival depended not on mercy or civilization, but on speed, cunning, and the ability to endure suffering that would break lesser men. The Mongol plateau in the 12th century was a fractured wasteland of competing clans, each locked in endless cycles of raid and counter-raid, blood feud and betrayal. There were no cities here, no written laws, no grand monuments to human achievement. There was only the steppe-in ocean of grass stretching from horizon to horizon, interrupted occasionally by rocky outcrops and swift rivers. A landscape so vast and empty that it seemed to swallow human ambition whole. The people who lived here were nomads, moving with the seasons, following their herds of horses, sheep, and goats. Living in felt tents called gairs that could be dismantled and transported in hours. They were expert horsemen from childhood, learning to ride before they could properly walk. And their entire culture revolved around mobility, adaptability, and martial prowess. But they were also desperately poor, chronically disunited, and viewed by the settled civilizations to their south, the Chinese, the Persians, the Arabs, barbarians, primitive raiders, worthy only of contempt or extermination. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father Yasuge was poisoned by rival Tatars, and the boy's world collapsed. His family was abandoned by their clan, left to starve on the margins of Mongol society, scavenging for roots and fish, hunted by enemies, reduced to the lowest possible status. Temujin's mother Holin held the family together through sheer force of will. But the young boy learned lessons in those desperate years that would shape everything he later became. That loyalty was everything, that betrayal was the greatest sin, that traditional hierarchies meant nothing if you lacked the strength to enforce them, and that survival required absolute ruthlessness. He killed his own half-brother Bekter in a dispute over food, an act that horrified his mother but demonstrated the cold pragmatism that would characterize his entire career. Over the next 2 decades, Temujin clawed his way up from nothing, forming alliances, breaking them when necessary, absorbing defeated enemies into his growing coalition, rewarding loyalty with unprecedented generosity, and punishing betrayal with extinction. He was captured and enslaved and escaped. He saw his wife Bert kidnapped by the Merkits and launched a rescue that became legendary. He befriended and then betrayed his blood brother Jamuka when their visions for the future of the Mongol people diverged. Slowly, methodically, he united the fractious tribes of Mongolia under his banner. Not through traditional claims of noble birth, his lineage was respectable, but not exceptional, but through demonstrated competence,
strategic brilliance,
and an ability to inspire fanatical loyalty in his followers. In 1206, at a great gathering called a Kurultai on the banks of the Anan River, the assembled chiefs of Mongolia proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, and in doing so, it created something the world had never seen before: a unified Mongol nation with the organizational capacity, military sophistication, and imperial ambition to conquer not just their immediate neighbors, but a substantial portion of the known world. What made the Mongols so devastatingly effective was not any single technological innovation or tactical brilliance, but rather a comprehensive system of warfare, logistics, and social organization that was generations ahead of anything their enemies could muster. A system built on the foundation of the steppe nomad lifestyle, but refined and systematized by Genghis Khan's genius into the most formidable military machine the medieval world would ever encounter. At the heart of Mongol power was the horse, but not in the way most people imagine. The Mongol horse was not the magnificent Arabian stallion or the powerful European destrier, but a small, stocky, unimpressive-looking animal with a shaggy coat and tremendous endurance, capable of surviving on minimal forage, traveling 50 miles in a day, carrying a fully equipped warrior across thousands of miles of varied terrain. Each Mongol warrior maintained a string of 4 to 6 horses, rotating between them to prevent exhaustion, which meant that a Mongol army could move at speeds that seemed impossible to their enemies, covering in a week what a European army might manage in a month. The Mongol warriors themselves were products of a lifetime of training. Boys who learned to ride almost before they could walk, who practiced archery from age 3 or 4, who spent their entire childhoods and adolescence on horseback, hunting, herding, and learning the skills that would make them the most feared soldiers in the world. The composite bow they wielded was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that took years to properly cure and construct, capable of penetrating armor at over 200 yards, and accurate enough to hit moving targets from horseback at full gallop. These were not simple weapons. Each bow required extraordinary skill to make and use, and Mongol warriors trained constantly to maintain their proficiency, shooting at targets while riding at high speed, learning to shoot forward, backward, and to either side with equal accuracy. But individual skill, while essential, was only part of the equation. What truly set the Mongol army apart was its organization and discipline, a structure that Genghis Khan personally designed and that broke completely with traditional step patterns of tribal warfare. He organized his forces into decimal units, squads of 10 men called an arban, companies of 100 called a jagan, battalions of 1,000 called a mingin, and divisions of 10,000 called a tumen. Each unit had clearly defined commanders, clear chains of command, and an emphasis on collective responsibility that was revolutionary. If one man in an arban deserted or failed in his duty, the entire unit could be punished. This created incredible cohesion and mutual accountability, transforming what had been loose confederations of tribal warriors into a professional army that could execute complex maneuvers with precision. The Mongols practiced combined arms warfare centuries before the term existed, coordinating heavy cavalry, light cavalry, and later siege engineers and infantry in ways that required sophisticated communication and timing. Their standard battle tactics were deceptively simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult to execute. They would typically begin with light cavalry screening forces probing enemy positions, then launch waves of horse archers who would ride close to enemy formations, loose devastating volleys of arrows, and wheel away before the enemy could respond, repeating this process until the enemy formation began to break, or gaps appeared in their lines. They were masters of the feigned retreat, a tactic where Mongol units would appear to break and flee, drawing overconfident enemies into pursuit, stringing them out and exhausting them before the retreating Mongols would suddenly turn. Reinforcements would appear from concealment, and the hunters would become the hunted. This required remarkable discipline. Soldiers had to resist every instinct to actually flee when conducting a false retreat, and to maintain formation and communication while appearing to be in disarray, and had to trust that their commanders would spring the trap at the right moment. The Mongols also pioneered the use of intelligence and psychological warfare to a degree that would not be matched until the modern era. Before attacking a target, they would spend months or even years gathering information. They would send merchants who were actually spies to map cities, assess defenses, and identify factional divisions that could be exploited. They would interrogate travelers and refugees. They would capture enemy soldiers and torture them for tactical intelligence. They understood that fear was a weapon as powerful as any sword or arrow, and they cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness deliberately, knowing that cities that surrendered immediately would be spared, while those that resisted would face total annihilation, entire populations slaughtered, buildings burned, and in some cases land salted so nothing would grow there again. This reputation preceded them and caused many cities to surrender without a fight, saving Mongol lives and resources. The stories of Mongol atrocities were not exaggerations. When the city of Nishapur resisted and killed Genghis Khan as son-in-law during the siege, the Mongols reportedly slaughtered every living thing in the city, including cats and dogs, and built pyramids from the skulls of the dead as a warning to others. Such actions were calculated terrorism, designed to break enemy morale across entire regions and make future conquests easier. The logistics that supported Mongol campaigns were equally sophisticated and drew directly on the traditional practices of nomadic life adapted for military purposes. A Mongol warrior traveled with remarkable efficiency, carrying little more than his weapons, a change of clothes, and some dried meat and curd. The famous Mongol iron rations of dried milk, curds, and preserved meat could sustain a warrior for weeks. They would often ride for days without stopping to cook, eating dried rations in the saddle, and when necessary, They could survive by drinking mare's milk, or even letting blood from their horses and drinking it. A practice that horrified settled peoples but allowed Mongol armies to operate far from any supply lines. Their horses could survive by grazing, even in winter when they would use their hooves to break through snow to reach frozen grass beneath, which meant Mongol armies were not dependent on baggage trains or supply depots the way European or Chinese armies were. When campaigning in wealthier, settled regions, the Mongols would plunder systematically, stripping the countryside of food and valuables and using local populations as forced labor or even as human shields during sieges. They developed an efficient system for managing conquered territories, appointing governors called daragachi who were responsible for taxation, conscription, and maintaining order, and who reported directly to the Khan through an elaborate courier system called the Yam. The Yam was a network of way stations positioned approximately a day's ride apart across the empire, where official messengers could obtain fresh horses and continue their journey without delay. This allowed information to travel across Asia. At unprecedented speeds, a message could go from Karakoram in Mongolia to the edges of Europe in a matter of weeks. Giving the Mongol high command strategic awareness and coordination capabilities that their enemies could not match, the Mongols were also remarkably pragmatic and willing to learn from conquered peoples, adopting whatever technologies or techniques they found useful and discarding the rest. When they encountered the settled civilizations of China, Persia, and Central Asia, with their sophisticated siege engineering and gunpowder weapons, they quickly recruited Chinese and Muslim engineers and incorporated siege warfare into their repertoire. They learned to build and deploy trebuchets, siege towers, and battering rams. And they became so proficient at siege warfare that they could reduce fortified cities that had been considered impregnable. They adopted administrative practices from the Chinese bureaucratic tradition, using written records and formal taxation systems to extract wealth from their conquests more efficiently than simple plunder ever could. They were religiously tolerant in an age of religious warfare, not out of any philosophical commitment to pluralism, but because they pragmatically recognized that allowing conquered peoples to maintain their religions kept them pacified and productive, and because they were genuinely curious about different belief systems and wanted to learn from them. The expansion of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors was breathtaking in its speed and scope, transforming the Mongols from a collection of nomadic tribes into the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Genghis Khan's first targets were the neighboring peoples of Central Asia and northern China's civilizations, with far greater populations, wealth, and technological sophistication than the Mongols themselves, but fatally divided and unprepared for the storm about to engulf them. The Jin dynasty of northern China had 50 million people, walled cities, sophisticated military forces, and a bureaucratic state apparatus, but they were corrupt, complacent, and had made the fatal error of treating the Mongols with contempt, demanding humiliating tributes and playing Mongol factions against each other. When Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin in 1211, he brought 100,000 of the finest cavalry in the world against a kingdom that had grown soft and divided. The Mongol conquest of northern China took decades and was characterized by horrific brutality. Cities that resisted were razed, populations massacred, and the Mongols learned siege warfare by trial and error, gradually mastering the techniques needed to crack the formidable fortifications of Chinese cities. They diverted rivers to flood cities, built massive siege engines, and used prisoners as human shields and forced labor. The psychological impact was devastating. Chinese chroniclers described the Mongol invasions as apocalyptic events, disasters sent by heaven to punish human sins. Meanwhile, to the west, the Khwarezmian Empire controlled much of Central Asia and Persia, a wealthy Muslim state with great cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of learning and trade that had stood for centuries. Genghis Khan initially sought trade relations with the Khwarezmian Shah, but when the Shah's governor at the city of Otrar murdered Mongol merchants and envoys in 1218, he sealed his empire's fate. The Mongol response was systematic annihilation. Between 1219 and 1221, Mongol armies swept through Central Asia like a scythe through wheat, destroying cities that had existed for millennia. Bukhara was burned, Samarkand's population was largely slaughtered, Merv, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, was so thoroughly destroyed that its population, estimated at over 1 million, was reduced to perhaps a few thousand survivors. The Khwarezmian Shah died in exile, broken and hunted, and his son Jala al-Din, though a capable warrior, could only fight a desperate rearguard action before fleeing to India. The Mongols pursued their enemies with relentless determination when Jalal al-Din tried to make a stand at the Indus River.
Ow.
The Mongols crushed his forces and he barely escaped with his life. Leaping his horse off a cliff into the river in a scene that became legendary, the wealth plundered from these conquests was staggering. Entire cities' worth of gold, silver, silk, and precious goods flowed back to Mongolia, transforming the economic status of the Mongol elite and funding further expansion. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse, though the exact circumstances remain mysterious and were deliberately obscured, the Mongol Empire could have fragmented as steppe empires usually did, dissolving into competing factions. Instead, his sons and grandsons continued the expansion, driven by a combination of ambition, the momentum of conquest, and a sophisticated ideology of world dominion that Genghis Khan had cultivated. His third son, Gedai, became the Great Khan and oversaw the conquest of the rest of northern China and the beginning of the Mongol invasion of Europe. The European campaign of 1241 to 1242 remains one of the most terrifying episodes in Western history, a moment when it appeared the entire Christian world might fall to an unstoppable Asiatic horde. Led by Genghis Khan's grandson Batu and the brilliant general, subtly the greatest military commander you've never heard of. A man who won more battles and conquered more territory than any other general in history, Mongol armies smashed through Russia, Poland, and Hungary with contemptuous ease. The Russian principalities, divided and feuding, fell one by one. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was obliterated in 1240. Its population slaughtered, and its great churches reduced to rubble.
Ow.
The Mongols then split their forces and attacked Eastern Europe from multiple directions simultaneously, displaying a level of strategic coordination that seemed impossible given the distances and communication technology of the time. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a combined force of Polish knights, German Teutonic knights, and other Christian warriors was annihilated by Mongol forces that used their standard tactics of mobility, archery, and feigned retreats to devastating effect. 2 days later, at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, Subotai orchestrated perhaps his masterpiece, destroying a Hungarian army twice the size of his own force through a brilliant use of terrain, deception, and coordinated cavalry charges. The Mongols left a deliberate escape route for the Hungarians, then pursued and slaughtered them over hundreds of miles as they fled in panic. King Belafor of Hungary barely escaped with his life, and contemporary chroniclers describe the aftermath as apocalyptic fields covered with bodies, rivers running red with blood, cities in flames. And the Mongols were poised to continue west when news arrived that Gedai Khan had died in Mongolia. By Mongol law and custom, all the princes had to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would elect the new Great Khan, and so Batu withdrew his armies from Europe. Western Europe was saved not by any military victory or strategic brilliance, but by pure luck and Mongol succession politics. The Europeans never fully understood how close they had come to total conquest, and many credited their deliverance to divine intervention. The Mongol Empire at its height under Genghis Khan in the 1250s stretched from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the borders of Egypt, encompassing perhaps 100 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population at the time. It was governed through a sophisticated system that balanced Mongol military dominance with pragmatic adoption of local administrative practices. The empire was divided into 4 major khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan dynasty in China. With the Great Khan in Mongolia, theoretically supreme overall, though in practice, the khanates became increasingly independent. Each khanate developed its own character, adopting different religions and cultural practices from their subject populations while maintaining Mongol military and political dominance. The Golden Horde eventually converted to Islam and became thoroughly Persianized. while the Yuan dynasty in China attempted to maintain Mongol identity even as they adopted Chinese administrative practices. The Mongol Peace, or Pax Mongolica, created unprecedented opportunities for trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. The Silk Road flourished as never before, with merchants able to travel from Europe to China under a single imperial authority that protected trade routes and enforced contracts. Marco Polo's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan was possible only because of Mongol power and patronage. Religious travelers, artists, and scholars moved freely across the empire. Technologies and ideas spread in all directions. Chinese printing techniques reached the Middle East. Persian astronomical knowledge reached China. And European missionaries reached the Mongol court, hoping to convert the Khans to Christianity. The Mongols established a postal system, legal code, census system across their territories, creating a degree of administrative uniformity that was remarkable given the cultural diversity of their empire. Yet this vast empire also brought catastrophic destruction on a scale that's difficult to fully comprehend. The Mongol invasions may have killed as many as 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities that had existed for millennia were erased from the map, and irrigation systems built over centuries were destroyed, turning fertile agricultural lands into desert. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire reduced Persia's population by perhaps 75%. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate and Islamic Golden Age, with libraries burned, the House of Wisdom destroyed, and hundreds of thousands slaughtered. The Mongol forces led by Hulagu Khan reportedly threw so many books into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink. The sack of Baghdad was one of the great cultural catastrophes of human history, destroying irreplaceable manuscripts and ending the political unity of the Islamic world. China suffered similarly during decades of warfare. The population of northern China may have declined by tens of millions during the Mongol conquests, though estimates vary wildly. The Mongols practiced a deliberate policy of massacre and destruction against populations that resisted, and their contempt for settled agricultural life meant they sometimes converted cropland to pasture for their horses, destroying the economic base of entire regions. Modern historians debate whether the Mongol conquests should be understood primarily as unprecedented military achievement or as one of the greatest disasters in human history, and the answer is probably both. The military sociology of the Mongol Empire was as revolutionary as its tactics. Genghis Khan created a meritocratic system that was radical for its time, promoting commanders based on ability rather than birth, and breaking down traditional tribal loyalties by mixing warriors from different clans in the same units. He established a personal guard called the Keshik, drawn from the sons of commanders and nobles, who served as both elite troops and a training ground for future leaders. The Keshik members received special privileges and training, and many went on to become governors and generals, creating a loyal administrative class bound directly to the Khan. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, established rules for everything from military discipline to property rights to religious tolerance. And while the exact contents are lost, it was apparently kept secret and transmitted orally. We know it emphasized loyalty, discipline, and harsh punishment for betrayal or cowardice. The death penalty could be imposed for desertion, for adultery, for lying to superiors, for theft beyond a certain value, creating a society that was brutal but ordered, where merit could overcome birth and where clear rules applied to everyone. Women in Mongol society had more rights and authority than in most contemporary civilizations. They managed households and herds, while men were away campaigning. They could own property, they participated in councils, and in rare cases they even ruled as regents. Trajine Khatun and Oghul Khaimish served as regent of the empire between great Khans, and Sorgatani Beki was one of the most powerful and respected figures in the empire. Mother to both Mangi Khan and Kublai Khan, renowned for her political acumen and administrative ability. The Mongols practiced religious tolerance not out of philosophical commitment, but pragmatic calculation. They employed Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and shamans in their administration and courts, exempted religious institutions from taxation, and patronized multiple faiths. apparently believing that having many different peoples pray for Mongol success couldn't hurt. This tolerance extended to a genuine intellectual curiosity. The Mongol Khans held religious debates at their courts, where Christian bishops, Muslim scholars, Buddhist monks, and Taoist priests would argue theology with the Khans as interested spectators. The beginning of Mongol decline came ironically at the moment of their greatest expansion. Menangi Khan's death in 1259 during the campaign to conquer Song China triggered a succession crisis that split the empire. His brothers Kublai and Arik Bey both claimed the title of Great Khan, and the resulting civil war weakened Mongol unity permanently. Al-Kublai eventually won and established himself as Great Khan and Emperor of the Yuan dynasty in China, but the other Khanates increasingly went their own way. Kublai Khan was a different sort of Mongol ruler. He was fascinated by Chinese culture, surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, built a magnificent capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and attempted to rule China as a Chinese emperor, while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. His reign was the high point of the Yuan dynasty, but it also represented a transformation of the Mongols from nomadic conquerors into sedentary rulers. A transformation that diluted their martial culture and created resentment among more traditional Mongols who saw Kublai as having betrayed their heritage. Kublai launched two massive failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, the second involving perhaps 140,000 troops in one of the largest amphibious operations in pre-modern history. Both invasions were defeated by a combination of fierce Japanese resistance, Mongol unfamiliarity with naval warfare, and typhoons that destroyed much of the invasion fleet storms the Japanese called kamikaze, divine winds sent by the gods to protect Japan. These failures were humiliating and costly, draining resources and demonstrating that Mongol power had limits. Kublai also attempted to conquer Southeast Asia. With mixed results, Vietnam repeatedly defeated Mongol invasions through guerrilla warfare and determination. While campaigns in Burma and Java achieved little, the Yuan dynasty in China became increasingly Sinicized and bureaucratic, losing the military edge that had made the Mongols so fearsome. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan dynasty was collapsing under the weight of corruption, natural disasters, and Chinese rebellions. And in 1368 they were finally driven out of China by the Ming dynasty, retreating back to Mongolia and reverting to the nomadic lifestyle from which they had come. In the Western Khanates, the story was different, but the outcome similar: gradual decline, conversion, and absorption. The Golden Horde converted to Islam in the early 14th century and became culturally Turkic while maintaining nominal Mongol political structures. They dominated Russia for over 2 centuries, extracting tribute and preventing the Russian principalities from uniting. But by the 15th century they were fragmenting into smaller khanates and losing their grip. The Ilkhanate in Persia also converted to Islam, abandoned nomadic life, and by the mid-14th century had dissolved into competing successor states. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia lasted the longest in recognizably Mongol form, but it too eventually fragmented. The last great Mongol conqueror was Timur, better known as Tamerlane, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and attempted to restore the Mongol Empire in the late 14th century, conquering much of Central Asia, Persia, and India with a brutality that rivaled his supposed ancestor. But his empire died with him in 1405. The Mughal Empire in India, founded in the 16th century, was established by descendants of both Timur and Genghis Khan. While they claimed Mongol heritage, they were culturally Persian and Islamic, removed from the steppe nomads who had terrorized the world 3 centuries earlier. The legacy of the Mongol Empire is complex and contested. On one hand, they created the largest contiguous land empire in history, demonstrated military and organizational innovations that influenced warfare for centuries, facilitated unprecedented cultural and commercial exchange across Eurasia, and showed that a society most civilized peoples, considered primitive and barbaric, could conquer and rule the most sophisticated civilizations in the world. The Mongol postal system influenced later communication networks. Their religious tolerance was unusual for the medieval period, and their pragmatic adoption of useful technologies and practices from conquered peoples showed a flexibility that many more culturally chauvinist empires lacked. The Pax Mongolica made possible exchanges of knowledge, technology, and goods that might not otherwise have occurred. Chinese printing reached Europe. Persian astronomy reached China, and crops like rice and cotton spread to new regions. Some historians argue that the Mongol conquests, by connecting Eurasia in unprecedented ways, helped set the stage for the later age of global exploration and trade. On the other hand, the human cost was staggering: the massacres, the destruction of cities and irrigation systems, the deliberate policy of terror, the reduction of some of the world's most advanced civilizations to rubble. Modern estimates suggest the Mongol conquests killed 5 to 10% of the entire world's population, making them proportionally one of the deadliest events in human history. They destroyed centers of learning, disrupted trade networks that took generations to rebuild, and in some regions created devastation from which full recovery took centuries. The Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, may have spread along the trade routes the Mongols opened, though this remains debated. The Mongol example also showed that military supremacy, administrative efficiency, and brutal effectiveness could overcome cultural sophistication, wealth, and numerical superiority, a lesson that would be repeated throughout history by other nomadic and barbarian peoples, who conquered more civilized neighbors. What made the Mongols historically unique was not just their success, but the speed and scale of their conquests, and the degree to which they managed to unite and organize a people who had previously been fragmented and marginal. Genghis Khan's genius lay not just in military tactics, but in creating a system, a unified Mongol identity, a meritocratic military structure, a legal code, an ideology of world conquest, and an administrative apparatus that could actually govern the territories they conquered. Previous steppe confederations had raided and plundered settled civilizations, and occasionally even conquered them, but they usually dissolved quickly, or were absorbed by the peoples they conquered. The Mongols maintained their identity and control for generations, ruling China for a century, Russia for 2 centuries, and leaving successor states across Eurasia. The Mongol century, roughly 1200 to 1300, saw the transformation of world history, connecting East and West in ways that had never before been possible, demonstrating that geography and cultural barriers that had seemed permanent could be overcome by sufficient military power and organizational will. The image of the Mongol warrior, fierce, mobile, armed with a composite bow and riding a shaggy steppe pony, became one of the most feared and iconic images in medieval history. A symbol of sudden, overwhelming violence emerging from the vast, unknown spaces beyond civilization's borders. Yet we should also remember that the Mongols were human beings, not supernatural demons or purely evil forces. They were products of their environment and culture, shaped by the harsh conditions of the steppe, where survival required strength, adaptability, and ruthlessness. They valued loyalty, courage, and skill. They had sophisticated traditions of oral poetry and storytelling. They appreciated beauty and craftsmanship, even as they destroyed cities. And individual Mongols displayed the full range of human virtues and vices. Genghis Khan himself was a complex figure, brutal conqueror who massacred millions, yes, but also a brilliant strategist, an effective administrator, a man who promoted based on merit rather than birth, who could be generous to loyal followers, and who created a legal system that tried to establish order and justice within his own society. The Mongol generals and administrators who ruled conquered territories were often sophisticated, educated men who patronized the arts, commissioned histories, and attempted to govern effectively. The Mongol Empire was not a mindless, destructive force, but a deliberate project of world conquest, guided by intelligent, capable people who believed they had a mandate from heaven to rule the earth and who were willing to use any means necessary to achieve that goal. The tension between Mongol identity as nomadic warriors and their role as rulers of settled civilizations created constant conflicts and adaptations, and the eventual decline of Mongol power came partly from this tension. As they became more civilized and settled, they lost the martial qualities that had made them conquerors. But attempts to maintain pure Mongol identity made effective governance of agricultural civilizations difficult. The story of the Mongol Empire is ultimately a story about the possibilities and limits of military power, about what can be achieved through superior organization, tactics, and ruthless determination, and about what cannot be permanently sustained. They proved that a small, poor, technologically backward people could, through brilliant leadership and organizational innovation, conquer vastly larger and wealthier civilizations. They proved that cultural sophistication and economic development were no guarantee of military success. They proved that terror could be an effective weapon and that reputation could open gates that siege engines could not. But they also proved that conquest is easier than governance, that military supremacy cannot permanently overcome cultural and economic forces, and that empires built primarily on force tend to fragment when that force weakens. The Mongols changed the world, demonstrating that the map of civilization could be completely redrawn by a determined people emerging from regions previously considered marginal and irrelevant. They showed that the comfortable assumptions of settled civilizations that they were inherently superior to nomadic barbarians, that their walls and armies could protect them, that history moved slowly and predictably were illusions that could be shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats from the steppe. For a century, from roughly 1200 to 1300, the world lived in the shadow of the steppe, and that shadow stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. When that shadow finally receded, the world it left behind was fundamentally changed: new trade routes, new political configurations, new cultural syntheses, and a new understanding of what was possible. The Mongols did not create the modern world, but they helped destroy the medieval one, sweeping away old empires, old certainties, and old borders. And in the chaos and reconstruction that followed, new patterns emerged. Whether we judge them as destroyers or connectors, as barbarians or state builders, as demons or humans, we cannot deny that they were one of the most consequential forces in world history. And their story remains both fascinating and terrifying. A reminder that civilization is always more fragile than we like to believe, and that the course of history can be changed by a man born clutching a blood clot in his fist, who refused to accept the limitations his world tried to impose on him, and who bent half the world to his will through a combination of vision, violence, and administrative genius that we still struggle to fully comprehend 8 centuries later.